You open the message. You read every word. Maybe you even read it twice. Then you lock your phone and go back to whatever you were doing. A few minutes become an hour. An hour becomes tomorrow. The strange part is that you never decided not to reply. You simply didn't. Eventually, the reply starts feeling heavier than the message itself. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to say anything at all. Most people have experienced this from one side or the other. Maybe you've stared at your own inbox, wondering why someone saw your message but never answered. Or maybe you've been the person carrying around replies that exist only in your head. It's easy to interpret silence as disinterest. Sometimes it is, but human behavior rarely has only one explanation. The more interesting question isn't why someone ignores a message. It's what the mind might be trying to avoid by delaying a reply. Because from a psychological perspective, replying isn't simply sending words. It's ending uncertainty. It's making a decision. It's revealing something about yourself.
And for some minds, those small acts carry far more weight than they appear to. One possible explanation begins with something surprisingly ordinary. A message isn't just information. It's a request for your attention, your time, your emotional energy, or sometimes your identity. Imagine receiving a simple text that says, "Can we talk?" Those 3 words don't contain much information, but your brain immediately starts filling in the blanks. Is something wrong? Did I forget something? What kind of conversation is this going to become? Research in cognitive psychology suggests that our brains dislike unresolved uncertainty. When information is incomplete, the mind often generates possibilities faster than reality can provide answers. For some people, replying closes that uncertainty. For others, replying creates new uncertainty. What if I say the wrong thing? What if this conversation becomes longer than I have energy for? What if they misunderstand me? Suddenly, delaying the reply feels like delaying all those possibilities. Not because the message is difficult, because the future conversation feels unpredictable. And the human brain often treats unpredictability as something to manage before it's something to experience.
That's why people sometimes compose replies entirely in their heads without ever sending them. The psychological work happened. The behavioral step didn't. But uncertainty alone doesn't explain why this pattern becomes chronic for some people. Another layer has to do with how the brain manages emotional effort. We often think of replying as a task that takes 30 seconds. The brain doesn't always measure tasks by time. It measures them by switching costs. Imagine you're deeply focused on work, studying, relaxing, or simply trying to recover after a mentally exhausting day. A message arrives. Replying doesn't just require typing. It requires shifting into another person's world. You have to remember context, predict tone, choose words, consider how they'll be interpreted, and prepare for whatever comes next. For socially effortless people, this happens almost automatically. For others, every conversation involves dozens of tiny mental calculations that stay mostly invisible. The message says, "How have you been?" The brain hears, "Prepare to reopen a relationship." The message says, "Are you free this weekend?" The brain hears, "Make a commitment that future you will have to keep." From the outside, the delay looks irrational. From the inside, it can feel like postponing a surprisingly expensive mental transaction. That's one reason people often reply instantly to strangers about practical questions, but postpone answering close friends. The relationship matters more, which means the emotional calculations become more complex. This creates an interesting paradox. We often assume delayed replies mean someone cares less. Sometimes the opposite is closer to the truth. People occasionally postpone replies precisely because the relationship matters enough that they want to get it right. Of course, this isn't always the case. Some people simply lose interest or choose not to engage. But for many others, silence isn't emotional distance, it's emotional friction. That distinction matters, because friction creates a strange psychological trap. The longer the delay continues, the meaning of the reply starts changing. Yesterday's reply was simply an answer. Today's reply feels like an explanation. Next week's reply feels like an apology. Eventually, the person isn't responding to the original message anymore. They're responding to the silence itself. Now the brain has two conversations to solve instead of one. What should I say? And how do I explain why I disappeared? Behavioral research often describes avoidance as something that reduces discomfort in the short term while quietly increasing it over time. This is one example. Every postponed reply briefly removes pressure, but each day adds another invisible layer. Eventually, opening the conversation feels emotionally heavier than when it first arrived. That's why people sometimes think about replying dozens of times without actually doing it. The intention stays alive, the action becomes harder. But there's another psychological layer that rarely gets discussed. Sometimes people don't delay because they're avoiding the other person. They're avoiding seeing themselves. Every message asks us in a subtle way, who are you in this relationship? Are you available, reliable, funny, warm, interested, forgiving, confident? Most of the time, we answer those questions automatically.
But during periods of stress, burnout, anxiety, grief, or identity changes, those answers become less obvious. Imagine receiving a cheerful message while you're emotionally exhausted. You don't want to pretend you're okay. You also don't want to explain everything, so neither option feels honest. Silence becomes the temporary compromise, not because silence feels good, because every available response feels incomplete. Attachment research suggests that people learn different ways of managing emotional closeness throughout life. Some instinctively move toward connection during stress. Others instinctively create space until they feel emotionally organized again. Neither pattern appears from nowhere. They're often shaped by repeated experiences, relationships, temperament, and the nervous system's attempts to maintain emotional stability. These adaptations can protect people in one context while creating misunderstandings in another. The problem is that texting removes nearly everything our brains evolved to use when understanding other people. There's no voice, no facial expression, no immediate correction, no reassuring smile after an awkward sentence, only words. And words leave enormous room for interpretation. That's why someone can spend 10 minutes rewriting a message that another person reads in 10 seconds. The effort wasn't about grammar. It was about prediction.
Trying to control how another mind might interpret something, impossible to fully control. Ironically, this search for the perfect reply often delays communication far more than an imperfect reply ever would. Perfection becomes another form of postponement, not because perfection is the goal, because certainty is. And certainty rarely arrives before pressing send. Perhaps the most surprising part is that many people who delay replies aren't forgetting the conversation at all. They're carrying it with them, while driving, while showering, while trying to sleep. The unread, or rather unanswered, message quietly occupies attention in the background. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the mind's tendency to keep unfinished tasks mentally active. The conversation remains psychologically open, even when the phone is locked. What looks like avoidance from the outside may actually be ongoing engagement on the inside, just an engagement that never becomes visible. Of course, none of this means every delayed reply has hidden psychological depth. Sometimes people are busy. Sometimes priorities change. Sometimes relationships naturally fade. Human behavior almost always has multiple explanations. But reducing every unanswered message to rejection misses how complicated even ordinary social moments can become inside the mind. A small blue check mark can carry uncertainty, emotional energy, identity, prediction, habit, past experiences, and the quiet calculations of a nervous system trying to decide what feels safe enough to do next. Which means the silence between reading a message and replying isn't always empty. Sometimes it's where the real psychological story is happening. And if something as ordinary as answering a text can reveal hidden patterns about uncertainty, emotional effort, identity, and connection, it raises a much larger question. How many other everyday habits that seem random are actually quiet solutions your mind has been creating all along? Solutions that make perfect sense once you stop looking only at the behavior and start asking what problem the brain believed it was solving.